My name is Stella, and until a few months ago, I thought I had the perfect life. Jeff, my husband, is the kind of man most women dream about. Kind, devoted, and utterly dependable. We've been married for 6 years, and for the most part, our marriage has been nothing short of blissful. We share laughter, love, and dreams. Or at least, we used to. The day it all began seemed like any other. I'd gone to the mall to pick up a few things for an anniversary dinner I was planning for Jeff. I remember feeling happy and content as I wandered through the aisles, mentally ticking items off my list. And then I saw him. Michael. He was standing by the entrance of a store, scrolling through his phone, and for a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It had been over a decade since I'd last seen him, but there was no mistaking those broad shoulders, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, or the mischievous glint in his eyes that always made me weak in the knees. My high school sweetheart, my first love, the one who had once meant everything to me. I froze, unsure of what to do. My heart raced as I debated whether to approach him or walk away. But before I could decide, he looked up and saw me. His face broke into a smile, that same smile that had once melted my heart. "Stella?" he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Michael," I replied, my voice trembling ever so slightly. We stood there for a moment, just staring at each other, before he closed the distance between us and pulled me into a hug. It was warm, familiar, and disconcerting all at once. When he let go, he held me at arm's length, his eyes scanning my face as though trying to memorize every detail. "You look amazing," he said. "It's been so long." We fell into easy conversation, reminiscing about old times as though no time had passed. He told me about his career, his travels, and how life had unfolded for him since high school. I shared snippets of my life with Jeff, though I kept it brief, almost as though I didn't want to shatter the bubble of nostalgia that had formed around us. When he asked for my number, I hesitated for a moment before giving it to him. It felt harmless, innocent even. After all, what harm could come from reconnecting with an old friend? As I drove home that evening, a part of me felt giddy, like a teenager who had just bumped into her crush. But another part of me felt uneasy. I brushed it off, telling myself that it was just a fleeting moment of nostalgia and that nothing would come of it. I loved Jeff. My marriage was solid. I had no reason to worry, or so I thought. Later that evening, as Jeff and I sat down for dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about Michael. His laughter, his stories, the way he had looked at me as though I was still the girl he had once loved. I tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing instead on Jeff's easy smile and the warmth of his presence. But it was like a seed had been planted in my mind, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop it from growing. The next few days passed in a blur of routine, but Michael wasn't far from my thoughts. When he texted me a week later, asking if I'd like to meet for coffee, I found myself saying yes before I could think better of it. It was just coffee, I told myself. Just two old friends catching up. What harm could it do? When I walked into the cafe and saw him sitting at a corner table, that same mischievous glint in his eyes, I felt a flutter in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. We talked for hours, slipping effortlessly into the kind of deep, soul-bearing conversations we used to have when we were young. He made me laugh, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I should have stopped it there. I should have walked away and never looked back. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself looking forward to his texts, his calls, the stolen moments we began to share. It was as though a part of me that had been dormant for years had suddenly come alive, and I couldn't bring myself to let it go. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room while Jeff worked late, Michael's name lit up my phone. "Thinking about you," his message read. My heart skipped a beat as I typed out a reply, my fingers trembling ever so slightly. "Thinking about you, too." That was the moment I crossed a line I could never uncross. I wish I could tell you that I stopped myself before things went too far, that I had the strength to walk away from the temptation, but the truth is, I didn't. I let myself be swept away, caught in a whirlwind of passion and emotions that felt as exhilarating as they were dangerous. If you've ever found yourself on the edge of a choice that could change everything, you'll understand the allure of the forbidden. And if you want to know how it all unraveled, how one moment of weakness spiraled into a web of lies and betrayal, stay with me. Like, subscribe, and follow this journey because trust me, the twists and turns of this story are only just beginning. The first time I met Michael again outside of that cafe, it felt like I was walking into a dream I couldn't wake up from. We met at a quiet park one afternoon, far from the prying eyes of anyone who might know me. I told Jeff I was meeting a friend for lunch, a lie that rolled off my tongue far too easily. Michael was already waiting for me when I arrived, sitting on a bench under the shade of a large oak tree. His face lit up when he saw me, and my heart skipped a beat. I hated how easily he could still affect me, how his presence could make me feel like a giddy teenager again. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said as I sat down beside him. "I wasn't sure I should," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached for my hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through me. "I'm glad you did," he said, his voice low and earnest. We talked for hours, our conversations flowing effortlessly from one topic to another. He told me about his struggles, his dreams, and the things he wished he'd done differently. I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't with Jeff in years. There was something intoxicating about the way Michael looked at me, as though I was the only person in the world who mattered. The affair began that day, though neither of us spoke the words aloud. It was in the way he leaned closer to me, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that left me breathless. It was in the way I didn't pull away, the way I let myself be swept up in the passion and excitement that I'd been missing in my life. Over the weeks that followed, Michael and I fell into a pattern of stolen moments and whispered secrets. We met in out-of-the-way places, where no one would recognize us. Each encounter left me feeling exhilarated and guilty in equal measure. I told myself I could keep the two parts of my life separate, that I could have Michael without losing Jeff. But the lies began to pile up, each one heavier than the last. I found myself avoiding Jeff, unable to look him in the eye. He noticed, of course. He asked me if something was wrong, if I was unhappy. I assured him everything was fine, even as the weight of my deception threatened to crush me. Then one day, everything changed. I missed my period, and a cold dread settled over me. I took a pregnancy test, my hands shaking as I waited for the results. When the 2 pink lines appeared, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't even begin to untangle. I told Jeff the news that evening, watching as his face lit up with joy. He pulled me into his arms, his excitement infectious. "We're going to be parents," he said, his voice filled with wonder. I forced a smile, my heart heavy with guilt. In the weeks that followed, I convinced myself that the baby was Jeff's. After all, we'd been together during the time of conception. It was easier to believe that than to face the possibility that the child growing inside me might be Michael's. But deep down, I knew the truth. Michael was thrilled when I told him about the pregnancy, though I left out the part where I planned to let Jeff believe the baby was his. "This is our chance," Michael said, his eyes shining with hope. "We can be a family." I didn't have the heart to tell him that I couldn't walk away from Jeff, that I couldn't destroy the life we'd built together. Instead, I let him believe what he wanted, even as I clung to the fragile illusion of my marriage. But illusions can only last so long. If you've ever found yourself caught in a web of lies, you know how quickly it can spiral out of control. And if you want to see how this web unraveled, stay with me. Like, subscribe, and follow this journey because the storm is just beginning. I stood in the dim glow of the bathroom mirror one night. The house quiet except for the soft hum of the heater. Jeff was already asleep, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. My reflection looked the same. Dark, wavy hair falling past my shoulders, brown eyes that once held innocence, but I felt like a stranger. I was a woman caught between two lives, and the walls were closing in. The months of my pregnancy went by in a blur. Michael was attentive, always checking in, always wanting updates. Every time I heard his voice or saw his name flash across my phone screen, my heart twisted in knots. At home, Jeff treated me like a queen, doting on me and the baby he thought was his. He painted the nursery a soft yellow, bought every parenting book he could find, and spent hours talking to my belly, imagining the future we were about to share. I lived in fear of being found out. What if Jeff saw Michael's texts? What if Michael showed up unannounced? What if the baby was born with Michael's dark green eyes or his unmistakable dimpled chin? The possibilities haunted me, but I pushed them aside, burying my head deeper into the sand of denial. I was too far in to turn back. The day our son was born should have been the happiest day of my life. I remember holding him in my arms for the first time, his tiny fingers curling around mine. He was beautiful, perfect, and my heart swelled with a love so fierce it took my breath away. But as I stared into his face, my chest tightened. The shape of his nose, the slight cleft in his chin. It was Michael. There was no denying it. Jeff, however, was oblivious. He sat beside me, his eyes filled with tears as he cradled the baby. "He's incredible," he whispered, "just like his mother." I felt like a monster. Here was this man who had given me everything, who had been nothing but loving and supportive, and I had betrayed him in the worst possible way. But instead of coming clean, I leaned into the lie. I told myself it was for the best, that Jeff didn't need to know the truth. I convinced myself I could keep this secret forever. The first cracks appeared when Jeff's family came to visit a few weeks after the baby was born. His mother, a sharp-eyed woman who prided herself on her family's distinct features, took one look at the baby and frowned. "Doesn't look much like Jeff, does he?" she said, her tone light but her words cutting. Jeff laughed it off, brushing it aside with a joke about recessive genes. But I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. From that moment on, he started to notice things. The way the baby's hair was darker than either of ours. The way his eyes seemed to change color in the light. The subtle differences that couldn't be explained away. One night, as I was rocking the baby to sleep, Jeff came into the nursery and stood in the doorway, watching us. "Stella," he said quietly, "do you think he looks like me?" I froze, my heart pounding. "Of course he does," I said, forcing a smile. "He's your son." He nodded, but the doubt didn't leave his face. Over the next few weeks, I noticed him watching the baby more closely, comparing his features to ours. The tension in the house grew, the air thick with unspoken questions. I tried to act normal, to keep up the facade, but it was like walking on a tightrope, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I fell. The breaking point came on a rainy afternoon. I was in the kitchen, washing bottles, when Jeff walked in holding an envelope. His face was pale, his jaw set in a way that told me something was wrong. "What's that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he placed the envelope on the counter and slid it toward me. My hands trembled as I opened it, pulling out the piece of paper inside. It was a DNA test report. My stomach dropped. "Jeff, Don't," he said, his voice cold and hard. "Just don't." I looked at the paper, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. The test was conclusive. Jeff wasn't the father. "How could you?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "How could you lie to me about something like this?" "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said, my voice shaking. "I swear, Jeff, I never wanted to hurt you." He laughed bitterly. "Hurt me? Stella, you didn't just hurt me. You destroyed everything we had. I trusted you. I gave you my heart, my life, and this is how you repay me?" "I was scared," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to lose you." "Well, congratulations," he said, his eyes burning with anger and pain. "You've lost me anyway." As he walked out of the kitchen, I sank to the floor, the weight of my choices crushing me. I had lied to the man who had loved me unconditionally, who had built a life with me, and now I was paying the price. The fragile web of lies I had spun had finally unraveled, leaving me alone in the wreckage of my own making. It was hard to describe the silence that followed Jeff's confrontation. It wasn't just quiet. It was oppressive, suffocating, like the walls themselves were pressing in on me. He had stormed out of the kitchen after dropping the DNA results on the counter, leaving me alone to process the fallout of my own making. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the damning piece of paper in front of me. My hands trembled as I traced the words that confirmed everything I had tried so desperately to hide. Jeff wasn't the father. Michael was. And now the truth was out, shattering the fragile facade I had worked so hard to maintain. When Jeff finally came back into the room, his face was a mask of barely contained fury. His eyes, red from what I assumed were tears he refused to shed in front of me, bore into mine with a mixture of betrayal and heartbreak. "I need you to explain," he said, his voice eerily calm. "From the beginning." I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly explain the series of choices that had led us to this point? How could I justify the lies, the betrayal, the utter disregard for the love and trust he had given me? "Jeff," I began, my voice trembling, "I didn't plan for any of this to happen." "Then what did you plan for, Stella?" he snapped, his calm facade cracking. "Because it sure as hell seems like you plan to destroy everything we built together." Tears streamed down my face as I tried to piece together an explanation that made sense, even to me. I told him about running into Michael, about how the past had come rushing back, about the stolen moments that turned into an affair. I admitted that I had let things spiral out of control, that I had been selfish and reckless, but when it came to the pregnancy, I hesitated. "I didn't know for sure," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I hoped that the baby was yours. I convinced myself it was. I wanted it to be." Jeff let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "And what about Michael?" "Did he know? Did you let him believe this was his child?" I nodded, my head hanging in shame. "He knows. But I told him. I told him that I was staying with you, that this baby would grow up as yours." Jeff stared at me, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "So you lied to him too. And to me, you lied to everyone, Stella." "I was scared," I said, my voice breaking. "I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want to lose our life together." "Well, congratulations," he said coldly. "You've managed to lose everything anyway." The days that followed were a blur. Jeff moved into the guest room, barely speaking to me, except for the necessary logistics of daily life. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, felt cold and empty. I tried to talk to him, to apologize, to beg for his forgiveness, but he wouldn't let me. "You made your choices, Stella," he said one night, his voice devoid of emotion, "and now we're both paying the price." Michael, of course, found out about the confrontation. I hadn't told him, but Jeff had. He called Michael directly, furious and demanding answers. The fallout was immediate. Michael started calling me nonstop, wanting to talk, wanting to see the baby. But I ignored his calls, unable to face him. I was trapped between two men I had hurt deeply, and there was no way to fix it. One evening, Jeff came home with papers in his hand. "I've spoken to a lawyer," he said, his voice flat. "I want a divorce." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't blame him. I had destroyed the trust between us, the foundation of our marriage. There was no going back. "Jeff, please," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Can we at least try to fix this? For the baby's sake." He shook his head, his expression pained. "This isn't about the baby, Stella. This is about us, and there's nothing left to fix." The divorce was finalized a few months later. Jeff got joint custody of the baby. He said he couldn't abandon an innocent child, even if he wasn't the biological father. But our relationship was irreparably broken. As for Michael, I tried to make things work with him for a time. But the guilt and resentment between us were too much to overcome. Our relationship, built on lies and betrayal, was doomed from the start. I often think back to that day at the mall, When I first saw Michael after all those years, if I had just walked away, if I had chosen to stay true to Jeff and the life we had built together, everything would be different. But I didn't. I let my past consume me, and I paid the price. Now I'm left to pick up the pieces of my life, to try to be a good mother to a child who reminds me every day of the choices I made. It's not easy, but it's what I deserve. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that every choice we make has consequences. And sometimes those consequences are more devastating than we could ever imagine.